The second one, the second one was on brought the indigenous and Aboriginal perspectives, and this is the third one that is bringing perspectives from the global South or post-developmental perspectives. The next one is the post-capitalist perspective, belongs to post-capitalist perspective, and includes the legendary activist and intellectual Noam Chomsky, also one of the founding mothers of ecofeminism, Ariel Saleh, and also the world-renowned intellectual Gar Alperovitz from the United States, and so on and so forth. So I will invite you to have a look at the webinar series, and if you are interested to get more information. Thank you so much. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Hamid. That's fabulous. And certainly this whole program couldn't be done without the connection with the New Economy Network and the work that's being done there. And that relationship is really fundamental and foundational to the whole project. So I'm sorry that I didn't mention earlier, and certainly it's our commitment to record these sessions so they will be available later and accessible to a broader audience of people. So just so you're aware. So thank you, Hamid. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning. So Adjunct Professor Victoria-Grieve Williams. And I'm going to ask Victoria to introduce herself and tell you what she would like you to know about herself. But her topic this morning is Everywhen: Autonomy, Altruism, and Living Well. So thank you. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Can everyone hear me? Yes. I'm very flattered indeed to be talking with my colleague and friend Sara Motta, and also Ashish. Ashish is here. Oh, good. I can't see him. Never mind. I will see him. Where do I start? I always have a lot of trouble introducing myself, to be honest. I'm an Aboriginal person from Australia, and I'm Worimi from the mid-north coast, and of course that's very much where a lot of you are in Newcastle and north of Newcastle. You'd know about Worimi, but when I'm in Australia, I respectfully acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people on whose unceded ancestral and traditional lands I live, teach, and write when I'm in Australia. In the USA, I'm living in a city called Newburgh on the Hudson River in New York State, and I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Lenape tribe from the Algonquin language group. I'm on their ancestral lands, also unceded lands. We have an awful colonial history in the world, and I'll get on to talk about that a little more in a moment. I don't know what else I can say about myself. I did work at the University of Newcastle for some time. I'm very grateful for the opportunity I had there, and I'm extremely engaged with, I'm a historian, but I'm very much engaged with the future, and it's interesting, a lot of historians are. And my perspective, I guess, in the paper that I'm presenting tonight is really a global perspective. I think I'll just launch into that right now without further ado. I'm a historian, but I understand that history, in fact, is dead. The famous historical theorist, Keith Jenkins from the UK, said this in about 1994. And of course, the institution of history was outraged, the idea that history is dead. But I really think Jenkins is on to something. What he said is, I'm talking about big history. I'm talking about the big history. Of course, you know, individuals and families and groups will be interested in their histories and be pursuing histories. But the history of the great colonial conquests of the world is dead. And where I live now, I'm living in a part of the States that also had the Industrial Revolution alongside the UK. I didn't know that until I lived here, alongside the UK and Europe. And what's happened in this part of the world and in many parts of the world where there was an industrial revolution is there's extreme decay. The city that I live in is full of boarded up houses and very low socioeconomic groups like Detroit and other cities in the United States. And when you live in that and you experience it, you get an idea of what the future holds for us. And what I can see is there will be a future where people will not be concerned about history. All of our deep concerns now about people living on stolen Indigenous land and so on will fade because of the need to survive, first of all, and because of the huge breakdown of all the systems that we take for granted on Earth today. Now, I don't know why I'm so engaged with this. I don't know why I'm so fascinated. I know a lot of people think that this is just too stark a future. A lot of people are guilt-ridden. I don't recycle or something like that, or, you know, I'm driving a car that adds to the greenhouse gas effect or whatever. And others are just afraid. And I think there is a lot of reason to be fearful, but the worst effects of what's happening in this overpopulated world are going to fall on our children and grandchildren. And that's the reason why we need to be thinking deeply about what it will mean to live well in the Anthropocene. And a lot of people who are here listening to this, I'm sure you know about the Anthropocene. It was a word that was coined in about 1994, absolutely taken up in 2006. And that body of experts who make decisions about whether geological ages exist or whether the Anthropocene has begun has suspended judgment for the time being. But a lot of people recognise that what's going down on the Earth's surface now is, and into the next geological layer, is overwhelmingly the detritus of human activity on Earth. And one of the major things, of course, is radioactivity, and it may actually be radioactivity that is used as a marker for this new geological age. So we've come out of the Holocene. The Holocene started about 12,000 years ago. This is a section of my talk that I've got here talking about time. And time is very important when you're talking about the Anthropocene because of the geological ages that are involved in the Earth's crust. But there's also another aspect of time that I want to go into because of the Everywhen of the title of my talk. So the Holocene started approximately 12,000 years ago. Experts agree on that. And I've come to understand Indigenous people in the world as being people of the Holocene. And the Holocene is a very interesting period because it was like, you know, the Garden of Eden. People learned to live with nature. They were living within nature. Well, there was no other way for them to live because they understood through their philosophies and their life ways, that they were extraordinarily interdependent with the natural world. And so what happened with the growth of imperialism around the world and the growth of industry and so on was that the natural world started to be seen as something to plunder rather than something to live within. So the natural world became resources for people to use to make profit. And people too, whereas Indigenous people and people within the Holocene really managed their population growth. And it was put to me recently by a native scholar, a friend of mine, Donald Grinday, that he believes that the population explosion in the earth occurred because of the decline in the power of women in societies, because women have been very concerned with the role of women in childbearing, and they managed that. So while Indigenous people might have wanted to restrict their population growth, and in Australia, I believe Warramai families were no more than 2, maybe 3 children, maybe 3, not often. You know, all of that has changed with colonialism because they used to say men, money, and markets. So the idea was you increase the population in order to increase the consumers who are going to buy, who are going to be in the marketplace and buying these commodities. We're commodity capitalism. Right? So Indigenous people of the Holocene are now, you know, have become the true victims, if you like, of settler colonialism and of consumer capitalism. And so the way we live now, we're really imbued and ingrained with Western ideas of time and the idea that we're involved in progress. So the linear idea of time, sort of moving in an upward trajectory, perhaps towards the second coming of Christ or something. It's very Judeo-Christian idea of progress. So, and Indigenous people all around the world have had different conceptions of time. And Aboriginal people in Australia have an extraordinary perception of time. And that is that we are now living in normal time, but eternal time is always there with us, if you like, running along beside us. And eternal time we know is there because it erupts over into normal time. And people with the knowledge and the understanding can actually observe and relay that information. The eruption of eternal time into normal time is generally met with joy by Aboriginal people. And it's a very subdued joy in Warramai country, but one of my aunties used to tell me stories about this. I didn't know about eruptions of the dreaming then. I've read about it since in anthropological works. But in North Australia, people fall about laughing. And the reason they do is because it's proof that the ancestors are there with us. Because what happens after, if you like, our ancestors are behind us and they kind of, if you like, fall away over time. To about 2 generations, 3rd generation back falls into eternal time, where they become a part of the sacred paradigms for the way humans should behave on Earth. And a lot of the keys to that are found in stories about the natural landscape, the species, but also in the constellations in the night sky. There's a book of mine, Aboriginal Spirituality, Aboriginal Philosophy, and the social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal people. And in there, I use the example of a Yolngu man saying, I'm working very hard to keep up with that which has come before. And that is because his ancestors, now the paradigms for, and were in their elder years, paradigms for the way you should behave on earth are setting the pace for him. He has to keep up with those standards. I want to talk about those standards. Those standards include things like, values and ethics, things to do with autonomy versus connectedness. Now, nowadays, when people talk about mobs and they talk about families and tribes, and there seems to be a great consensus amongst Aboriginal people, I do believe that in our natural, if you like, cultural way of being, there was an awful lot of to and fro, a huge intellectual debate about various things. And Aboriginal people were expected to have their own opinion about things. And a lot of us were brought up in this kind of tradition, whereby even as, an adolescent, you'd be asked, well, what do you think of that? And you would be expected to have a position on it. So there's an idea of autonomy, that you can actually care for yourself, that you've got your own opinions and so on, but that has to be really juggled with an idea of connectedness. You need other people. And of course, in the future, there's going to be a real need for people to connect across different lifestyles, different disciplines, different ways of being, in order to solve common problems. And some of these being wicked problems. The wicked problems that they talk about in the Anthropocene, that is, problems that really have no solution. For example, where I live, there are carcinogens in the water supply. You may not be surprised, but there is a huge corruption, if you like, of the water supply across the United States, and particularly in an area like this, which is the old Industrial Revolution area. These problems need a lot of cooperation and collaboration to be addressing them. And of course, people are doing this. There's a Food and Water Alliance where I am that are addressing these problems, trying to. And made up of people from all walks of life, I might say. So, and the altruism of Indigenous ways of life, there's a saying, it's much better to give than to receive. People in Indigenous lifeways have actually been very proud of the fact that they had very little in material goods. Material goods were seen to be a problematic in many ways, particularly if you were moving from summer camps to winter camps, that kind of thing. You're on the move, collecting food and so on. You don't want to be carrying a lot of stuff, but at the same time too, my friend Wanta, Stephen Patrick from Larger talks about the gift highway, that Aboriginal people moved all over the continent visiting different groups, particularly neighbouring groups, but there was a movement of items as gifts. There wasn't consumerism. There wasn't an idea of making a profit or of exploiting a labour force or anything like that. Any sort of idea that tries to equate the way Aboriginal people were in pre-contact Australia with so-called European progress is extraordinarily misguided. In fact, the way I see it, Aboriginal ways of being far superior, and more than that, they're the ways of being that might heal this really fractured relationship that we've got with the natural world. So, so the idea of living well in Aboriginal Australia has been living without material goods. I'm very mindful, I don't want to talk over the time. I think I've got how many minutes left? 5, right. That's about perfect, actually. So living well means not having material goods. I remember a story, it was written in a book by Ralph Folds about Pintabee people in Central Australia. If there was a fight over something, like if someone wouldn't share their television, the television got destroyed, because the most important thing is the relationship. They call it walletje. And the relationship, that connectedness, had to be the first thing anybody considered. So Aboriginal people lived on this continent without a lot of material goods. My friend Paul Spearham from Gamma Ray people, he pointed out to me that the Gamma Ray actually means, in the language, I have nothing. It was a badge of honor to say that, I have nothing. But at the same time, I have everything. What I want to say is, in the future, as we move further into the Anthropocene, with all the climate shocks and the breakdown of systems, and a lot of the things that we rely on now just will not be available, plus the world population growing at such a rate that there's going to be fierce competition over a lot of things we take for granted now. And I do believe that things that, like needles and thread and all kinds are going to become really prized, because we won't have access to those manufactured goods from Asia and places that we have now. So what is similar to the way Aboriginal people lived on the continent is that there will be a lack of material goods. How do you live well if you're a consumer capitalist who recreates by going to the mall, and who of course our lives are full of ideas that if we just buy something else, we're going to have a better life. So how do people adjust to that? That's really where the whole nature of Indigenous society comes into play, where people bring in to their lifeways a very rich artistic and cultural way of being that involves music, dance, art, theatre, and it's not consuming this stuff, but being a part of it. So being involved in dance, ritual or celebrations or whatever as a participant. And of course, this kind of thing is happening with Indigenous groups all over the world. They are returning, and they have been since my awareness, since about the 1980s, there's a big return to cultural ways of being. I've been to powwows in America where people were dancing for the first time in their lives, and they were, they were grandparents, in fact. And that kind of thing is happening. So, is there going to be an opportunity for enjoyment, for recreation and entertainment in the Anthropocene? Yes, but there's going to have to be a huge shift in the way people are relating to each other, connecting to each other, and the ways in which they see themselves in relationship to the natural world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. That's beautiful, fabulous. Thank you very much. I know people will have questions. We will save them to the end, but if you did want to put any questions into the chat as we're going along, even as things occur to you, please feel free, and I will transfer them across and kind of then I'll kind of ask those at the end, and particularly to the whole panel. So thank you so very much. Can I now introduce Associate Professor Sara Motta, And again, I'll ask her to introduce herself, but democracy motherwise, Enfleshments from the Margins of Modernity is the topic for this presentation. So welcome, and yeah, we look forward to your talk, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invite, and thank you to Vicky for beginning and setting off this journey today. It's nice to be in circle with you again as well, and to meet you, Ashish. And also hello, Ariel, if you're still there. I miss you. Okay, so I just would like to acknowledge where I sit. I sit kind of at estuary point where salt and fresh waters meet of Awabakal and Warramai peoples, and I really want to acknowledge their custodianship of the land and country here, and their ongoing sovereignties, and the gifts and welcomes that I have and my family have been held with on these lands. And also pay my respects to any other Indigenous people present today. I would like to convocar las energías de las abuelas y las ancestras para que nos acompañen hoy día y que nos ayudan así a encarnar una escucha profunda, ¿no? Y una conexión profunda de pluriversalidad, ¿no? No de homogeneizar. And I'd also like to just, so I was calling in actually the deep time, the eruptions of deep time there, to be present with us, the abuelas and the grandmothers of my lineages, and the recovery of those lineages that Vicky was talking about. And I'd like to also just call in fire, so that the fire, the energies of fire accompany us in being the direction of our passion and our commitment and our determination, in ways that clear the mess and all the mistiness that surrounds us politically at the moment, and also water so that our encounter might flow and dive as deeply as it needs to go today, really. So I'm sitting here from my bedroom. I have taken my pajamas off, which is quite a shock. And I am in lockdown. I'm a single parent and I have 3 dependents, and the violences of this current system and what it does to race and feminize women and kin are something I live with, right? So this is difficult for me to do this kind of work right now, at the same time as I take it as a responsibility. I was saying to my 6-year-old who was having a meltdown before I came in here, and where I had to leave as Vicky was talking just a little bit, and I was going, you know, I'm doing this, but because I have a responsibility, right? I have a responsibility to my communities. I have a responsibility to myself to share particular knowledges and learnings that have been gifted to me or have been involved with. So I'm just going to drop in a little bit some of the practices that I've been involved with as a scholar who is a barefoot philosopher, as a scholar whose work in community is a co-collaboration to create the conditions for healing liberations from the ongoing violences and alienations of this current system, and that therefore develops and co-develops differing modes of coming to know, meaning making and transformation with the kin that I work with. In this case, I'm going to talk, I think, a lot about Colombia. I'm from Colombia. A big part of my lineages are from Colombia, and I've worked for many years when I've been able to and lived there. And I'm going to just note a few things to start with. So there are ongoing violences of dispossession against poor mestiza, indigenous and Black communities in Colombia and the lands of the Southwest, in the Valle de Cauca and the cities of Cali and Buenaventura, where I mostly am when I'm able to be there. Well, I'm there now anyway, but because time is multiple and space is multiple, but and they're here too, and I acknowledge them. These violences have kind of been systematic, and they've been involving either ongoing displacements, so with slavery for Afro-Colombian communities, and displacements from land and their commodification. and that displacements from land are also displacements from the kind of kinship and cultural relationships and ways of life and economy that kind of Vicky was also touching on, right? But with difference. I don't want to homogenize. And I said that with the water and the fire, that I want the, you know, I want to make connections, but also keep distinctiveness too. And that in the struggles to survive, but also maintain and flourish, even and despite these ongoing violences of dispossession, of the breakup of families, of the breakdown of the transmission of knowledges, of languages, of modes of cultivation, of modes of caring for land, of modes of growing, of modes of weaving, of modes of healing and health, that at the forefront of these kinds of resistances, or these often we call them re-existencias, to kind of re-exist, that they're existential modes of being, yeah, and knowing. Often women and grandmothers are at the forefront of that. Often women and grandmothers are often at the forefront of multiple violences. So both the violences of dispossession from land, the violences of having children murdered or removed, the violences that then start to crisscross their own communities because of the systemic trauma, the violences of epistemological denial, where such women are often presented as delinquent, unknowing, undeserving, problematic, and when they politically organize, as dangerous, violent, kind of mad people. But they're also at the forefront of this, right? And so I kind of think it's, and this is what I've been doing, is that to name that. Not an exclusion, because it's always in relation to kin, and kin broadly understood as community, but also Madre Tierra, and also ancestors and Madre Tierra is living, Mother Earth is living. And that it's really important to note this, because particular wisdoms are therefore emergent in these kinds of practices, and wisdoms that I think can also give gifts to the thinking through of the land I live now, and the relationships I have now, and the political involvements I am in now, in relation for the kinds of problematics with polarization, with increasing state authoritarianism, and with all the kinds of kind of logics of separation, of alienation, and of disease that are crisscrossing where I sit now, right? And in relation with First Nations people, Indigenous people from these lands, sisters and brothers and others. So one of the key things that emerges is, because territories have been so violated, and these are territories of the land and territories of the body, that one of the most ferocious forms and impacts of the current system is when racialized and feminized women and family and kin internalize these logics, internalize the idea that we have nothing to give, that we are delinquent, that we are unlovable, that we actually are vacuous, right? We are epistemologically terra nullius. And so, and then the kinds of, from that internalization, the kinds of traumas that play themselves out, which I live, right? I live with this reality, with my own kin and with the, in relation. And so therefore the kind of healing liberations, or the politics of well-being, or of a life well lived, involves a recuperation of our territories in relation, our territories of spirit, of heart, of mind, our capacities to recognize each other and create logics of care and love and gift amongst us in multiple ways. These are contradictory and tension-ridden processes, but I'm just pulling out some thematics that might be really useful for us. And that this process is deeply, it's political. So these women and kin are organizing, they're standing to defend their territories, right, from kind of sugarcane plantations. They're standing to defend each other from the military incursions and the assassinations. They're standing and calling to account the men in their own communities, right, in terms of some of the dynamics that play themselves out, and creating processes and radical education processes which seek to return. It's really interesting, kind of certain resonances and the orders that we speak, right, in these kind of place spaces, and what threads come out, but to return to these deep knowings, right, to return to the return to the recognition that we are kind of all we need, that we have through this deep time and ancestral connection, through our relationships and dialogues together. And often this is very intercultural work in the region I work with, because there's been so much displacement, that so many people are displaced from kind of original territories, and it becomes much more complex, kind of urban, indigenous and Black identities. And so often this is intercultural. There's a sharing and recuperation of knowledges, and that these knowledges are about ways of being in the world. So they're not knowledges as just cognitive things or bits of information. They're knowledges that are deeply relational. They're knowledges that indicate other modes of responsibility to each other, to Madre Tierra, to ancestors, to the waterways. So defense of waterways is huge as well. And they often will center on kind of recovering, and there's many, many things, but recovering or sharing plant wisdoms. Like, it sounds really tiny, but plant wisdom. So how to care for particular plants in a particular terrain, how to communicate with these plants, and how to create medicine with these plants in a way that recognize they are our kin and they are our ancestors, and that they have particular qualities far beyond what a biomedical vision of well-being and health might look like. And that in recuperating these knowledges, we are recuperating relationships between grandmothers and aunties and mothers and daughters and sisters, that we are reweaving the relationships and the networks and the spider webs with which we can hold each other up, that we are developing practices to alternative and in dialogue with other West, with certain biomedical Western models, but to heal the traumas, to bring back vibrancy and well-being to the territories, the Madre Tierra, and ourselves as part of that. And that we are really entering into the presence of deep time and the presence of multiple relation, really entering into other ways of being. And that center, as Vicky says, totally like creativity, right? That returns us back. So Audre Lorde talks about the erotic. And she says, this is not an erotic as a kind of commodified, sexualized erotic. This is the deep power we contain within the sacred shakana, or the sacred womb of life, that we all carry, depending, it doesn't matter where we sit in terms of the sex division or whatever. And that we can reconnect to that, and that enables us to find both our no's and our yeses, and to connect with that deep flow of life through multiple different cultural practices. So the pedagogies developed, why I talk about a lot Enfleshing reason, they understand that we come to know and we come to transform and we come to heal and create well-being through the knowledges of the body, through the knowledges of these territories, through the knowledges that bring dance and storytelling, of ceremony. And that doesn't mean we don't think too, but it's like, it's actually reimagining the very process of reason. And so I kind of talk about this, and I can't do much here, but I just want to drop that in as well, just drop it in. And of course, this embeds care and courage. So the care and the attentiveness to take the time in these processes where we come to share all our grandmothers' stories, where we come to listen to each other deeply, where we come to remember and listen to Madre Tierra and the voices of the ancestors, and trust them. When I called in this just now, I said, I trust that you will, we will drop in what needs to drop in today, whatever that is, and allowing that, we come to trust that and that flow. We come to trust our own knowing in relation. So as individuals in relation, as an individual autonomy in relation to all these multiple subjects and beings. And it also involves great courage, because then we stand. I mean, it takes courage to survive anyway, when you're being policed, when you're having your lands removed, when there's this trauma that's denied, and when your own being's denied. So it takes courage anyway. So raised and feminized folks tend to be pretty courageous and pretty, you know, anyway, but it takes a kind of collective conscious courageousness to stand as well, but to stand in relation and to stand with care. And there are many debates right now about what that looks like, and relationships with what does it mean to stand and defend our territories, both in the urban and the rural. I'm not going to go into that, I don't think. I think it's needed. I just think dropping in this is enough for now. I think really important is the different movements I'm involved with, and here as well, have different relationships with the state. There are relationships and sometimes resistance to the violences and the authoritarian logics, and sometimes, you know, working with folks who sit in the state who are kind of allies to the extent that they can be, right? And sometimes folks from the, you know, there's differing relationships, but I think what's really important is that we there's a kind of commitment to not become police of each other. There's a lot of discussion here, like I work with quite a lot of abolitionists, Aboriginal abolitionists here, women, and like not internalizing the cop in our heads. Again, so not internalizing those logics and irrationalities and violences in the modes in which we deal with each other. And so there's often differing developments of kind of justice systems and differing practices and modes of dealing with harm, which don't seek to reproduce the harm that is structured in the settler state. 4 minutes to go. So I now want to take this here. So we're in a moment where there is increasing polarization being pushed by very powerful forces here in Australia, and where we have an increasingly authoritarian state who is engaging with the pandemic very much in policing terms, right? And in settler terms. So I just want to drop in some ideas about what that might mean for us who are interested in already co-weaving a politics of well-being in these lands in relation and centering the voices of First Nations kin in these lands, and always in relation to that. One, the kind of role of the pedagogical and deep listening, the kind of role of doing that community work in dialogue and of embodying those kinds of ethics of care and escucha profunda, and the idea that our subjectivities are often really crisscrossed and complex and increasingly messy in this time where these certainties for some are falling away. Yeah, the ensuring that the critiques, so for example, they're policing the racialized and working class communities in some of the suburbs in Sydney, to actually stand with those communities, like they're the communities that need to be defended from this racialized classed policing that does not provide support for casualized workers who are being forced to go to work and often we have other registers of care and kin, not in heteronormative, privatized family types, and therefore there are responsibilities of caring. And so this virus, I know people have different relationships to how they view this, but this virus spreads. And then there's vulnerabilities because of the ongoing oppressions of the poverty already in the policing. So they're the kind of folks we need to be standing with, right? And who are our folks, who are our community. And that, I think some real care. So there's a lot of critique of the state, the mandatory vaccinations, the state policing and the ongoing logics of settler kind of capitalism. But often it's the state that is centered. And if we remove our praxis or our critique from connecting that to settler coloniality and capitalism, it can become a right-wing libertarianism. And that's where the alt-right, the powerful souls who are presenting themselves as with the people and for freedom in a very individualistic logic of freedom, the Carceral logic of freedom, are hooking into some of our communities who are quite rightly critiquing the policing response and the authoritarian nature of the contemporary state in Australia. And so That obviously means centering the kinds of stories and the kinds of knowledges that Vicky has shared with us from these lands. So I sit on them in the ways in which we think pedagogically and politically about our current moment, and don't end up reinforcing logics of polarization that harm and that actually play into the powers that be behind the scenes who want us fighting each other. So I think I will end there.
Thank you, Sarah. Fantastically beautiful. And like the comment said, that there's many spectacular pieces of thinking that we've kind of already heard this morning. So thank you. And I look forward, as people pop questions in, I'm just bringing those across for discussion shortly. So now I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Professor Ashish Kothari. And the topic this morning, and I hope I pronounce this suitably, Ecoswaraj, a radical ecological democracy towards justice and sustainability. So welcome and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And thanks to Victoria and Sara for laying a very solid and fluid ground for the discussion that we're going to have today. Thank you a lot. I'd like to also acknowledge the struggles of many communities all over the world to sustain their ways of being in the onslaught of the kind of status capitalist patriarchal society that we have today that is dominating us. I have learned, most of what I'm going to say today is what I've learned from these communities who are struggling on the ground. Nothing original in what I'm going to say. And so I would like to offer a deep acknowledgement and appreciation of these struggles. Unlike Victoria and Sara, I'm not so eloquent in my speaking, so I'm going to use some slides as a prop. If that's okay, I will share screen and get straight into the presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge Ariel. I think if she's still here, from whom also in collaboration with whom also I've learned quite a lot. So can you let me know if you're seeing the slides full screen? Okay, yes. Thanks. All right, so this term Ecoswaraj, which you announced, Chris, I will explain that a bit later in the presentation. What I'd like to do is to go through very quickly in a minute the kind of crises we're in, because all of us are familiar with it, so I don't need to go into any detail. I'll spend much more time on looking at the kinds of responses that people are giving across the world, both resistance and positive, constructive alternatives, and then come towards the end at some kind of a sort of a pluriversal frameworks that are emerging from these responses. Now, we all know, and this is something that Vic and Sara have also indicated, that development in the way it has come to most of us, especially in the global south, has been, despite all its promises and its glitter and its all the so-called indicators of progress and so on, it has come as enormous forms of violence against the rest of nature, as you see in this particular advertisement of forests being uprooted for laying an oil pipeline. And it has come as violence against communities, especially indigenous and other communities who live within, with, and dependent on the rest of nature. And in many different ways, this process of development in the last few decades, well, starting from colonial time, but especially also in the last few decades, has been what I call a movement from livelihoods that were occupations that were linked to ecologies, linked to social life, linked to cultures, to what we now have, which is the destruction of those sorts of livelihoods, and the creation in the modern economy of jobs which are separated from leisure and pleasure. And this is why we wait desperately for the weekend. And those are mostly jobs that are soul deadening, except for a few lucky of us who might actually be doing things that we really enjoy to do. So I call that a process from moving from livelihoods to to deadlihoods. And this is something we really need to confront. We've also seen, and this is something that I think Sara also talked about during the COVID pandemic, how there's two broad trends. One is where governments have used this as an opportunity to become more authoritarian, create more state surveillance on citizens, etc., in the name of health and social security, etc. And corporations have become even more profit-seeking, profit-hungry. You can see the figure there, the incredible figure of how much profit billionaires have made during this pandemic period, even as hundreds of millions of people have lost their livelihoods. But on the other hand, we're also seeing in these last 1.5 years, some of the most incredible expressions of human solidarity, of love, of generosity, of people actually going out of their comfort zones to help other people, young people helping elders, and so on and so forth. And I think it's that second part of what human nature can be and often is that I'd like to focus on much more. Because one of the questions that has arisen whenever we critique development, when we critique capitalism, when we critique state domination, patriarchy, etc., the question that of course comes back at us is, yeah, you may be right. Maybe there's ecological damage, maybe there's a climate crisis, but do we have alternatives? Or is this the only path that we have? And I think we really need to assert, based on grounded experiences and responses, that yes, there are alternatives. And they're broadly of two kinds. One is resistance. Again, both my predecessors have spoken about this. This particular picture is from about 30 years back, movement by indigenous people in central India against two mega hydroelectricity projects, where the government was looking at the river as something which could create 300 megawatts of power. And what this movement of indigenous people said was, you think of the river as megawatts and electricity. For us, the river is our mother, and we will not allow our mother to be shackled by your dreams of development. And it's this expression in resistance movements, this expression of different ways of seeing, of being, of acting, of dreaming, of knowing, that is so very important. We're seeing this in resistance movements around the world, whether it's the anti-racism movements in US and elsewhere, the current farmers agitation in India that's been going on for the last 9 months, the peace movements in Myanmar in the middle of heavy militarization, the youth climate justice movements, the movements for a new constitution in Chile, and many, many others around the world. It's not just about safeguarding livelihoods, it's about asserting different ways of knowing and being. And why this is so very important is because very often the same system that's created the problems is giving us very convenient solutions: carbon trading, green growth, green capitalism, green economy, even sustainable development. The latest buzzwords is net zero or no net loss, all of that, which is basically the system trying to sustain itself rather than sustain the earth, sustain its own profits rather than sustain lives that are in harmony with each other and with the earth. And we really have to go to the fundamental structures of oppression and unsustainability if we want to see through this kind of subterfuge, this greenwashing that is taking place, and then to be able to go to what are really radical and meaningful alternatives around the world. I'm going to give a few examples of these from different parts of the world. But this book, which I'll mention at the end, which Arya and I co-edited with 3 others, has 100 examples of these from different parts of the world. Oh, and by the way, I love this map. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but usually when I put it up to Indian audiences, they say, oh, why is it upside down? And I have to remind them that the so-called normal upside map is a map that was made in colonial times. It was made for Europe, the colonizing continent, to look, to be on top and to look much bigger than it actually is. So it's, I think, many different ways we have to be able to use the tools that also help us to decolonize our own constructs and our minds and create these very interesting discussions amongst people. So just to give you a few examples, as I said, this is one that for me has been enormously inspiring. This is from southern India. It's 5,000 women Dalit women farmers. Those of you know the Indian caste system would know that Dalits are the most oppressed section of Indian society, the so-called outcasts or untouchables. And as women, of course, they're also oppressed in a patriarchal masculine society. So in the last 25 to 30 years, these women, about 5,000 of them, have created women's committees or sanghas, as they call them, collectives across about 75 villages, and then confederated them. And they have asserted to bring back their own traditional practices with the land, where the land was considered to be the mother and sacred and spiritual. Seeds were considered to be spiritual, and they completely rejected chemical-based farming and so-called green revolution, etc. Switched back to their traditional biologically diverse sense of farming. But the crucial part was a lot of sharing and exchanging and collective working amongst these 75 villages, asserting their own rights to the land as women, and much else. And because of all of this, they've been able to create not just complete food security for their families, but also food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with the growing and the consumption of food within themselves, with no government or no corporate involvement. They have, it's amazingly that the same community that used to go hungry 25 years back has been contributing to the food relief efforts during the COVID pandemic. If we go across to the other part of the world, in Peru, a very similar story from the Quechua indigenous people in the Andean highlands of Peru, which is part of the origin of the potato. Here they've been conserving hundreds of varieties of potatoes, growing them, taking complete control over what they call the biocultural landscape. And again, through all of this, creating food security and sovereignty, and also contributing to food relief in the nearby Cusco town to those who didn't actually have enough food. Coming to the sort of center of world, Central Western Asia, and we find another amazing example of both resistance and creative alternatives. This is by the Kurdish ethnic community, especially led by women. And as we know, this is the world's most war-torn area for a long, long, long time. This is in the middle of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria. But they've tried to create a large region of relative peace, of direct democracy, where local communities are actually taking their own decisions and then confederating over a large landscape, and based on their own ideology called genealogy, which is an eco-feminist ideology from their own cultures. A little bit further in north into the industrial part of the world, these are examples from Europe from within the belly of the beast, so to speak, within the capitalist system, the creation of alternative economies. Bottom right-hand side is a factory that is run completely by workers on a totally democratic principle. Everybody gets exactly the same amount of wage as everybody else, regardless of what work you're doing per hour of work. And all workers are involved in decision-making with regard to the factory. Just above that is a school that is run on very high-quality principles, but with very low fees, because the entire community, the neighborhood within which the school is located, provides free administrative services, free teaching to the school. So it's part of something called time banking, where people's experiences, expertise, services, goods are shared without monetary exchange. And this is something that traditionally always used to happen. I'm sure Aboriginal societies in Australia were always doing that. In India, traditional societies were always sharing their labor and their services without asking for money, all of which has kind of fallen into disuse with the onslaught of the capitalist system. But here they're trying to bring that kind of system back. On the bottom left-hand side is an example from one of the richest parts of the world, richest in monetary terms, where they've created their own local currency and tried to create a little bit of independence from the centralized euro, to say, at least for all of our local exchanges, we should try and use our own medium of exchange, which they call the Beki. So there are many of these examples. In fact, in our book, we have the great Australian Catherine Gibson's contribution on community economies, And it's really the sort of bringing back of these sorts of community or alternative economies that is very much part of the struggle. And lastly, also to talk about other urban areas. So the movement towards municipalism, especially feminist municipalism, for instance, in Barcelona, the attempt to try and actually create a sense of governance, a kind of governance which is not about hostile politics, but about collaboration, about working with each other, even with the so-called opposition parties, and constantly keeping one's ears to the ground of what are people's assemblies saying in neighborhoods in these cities. So finally, if I take another 5 minutes and bring these sorts of examples together, and there are hundreds and thousands of examples, of course, I could go on and on with them, is to bring them together into some kind of a sort of a more holistic vision of transformation that's taking place or should be or could be taking place. So one of the ways we've seen it within India in a process that I'll speak about at the end is to look at it a bit like the Olympic circles, but not as competition, which is what the Olympic circles are about, but about collaboration and solidarity in 5 spheres of life: the politics, the economics, the social, the cultural, and the ecological. And I know that sometimes these are artificial constructs, but just for understanding. I'm not going to go into all of these, it will take too much time. But just to give you a quick a glimpse of what this means. So if one looks at some of the examples in different parts of the world of indigenous self-determination, or in central India, there are villages that have declared that in our village, we are the government. We're actually talking about the original sense of the meaning of democracy, which is people's power, not the power of elected officials and politicians and bureaucrats, but people on the ground. And that assertion of direct democracy, or what we call Swaraj, which I'll explain in a minute, is one of the biggest transformations that is taking place or needs to take place. Now, along with that, and I think this is very, very interesting, is the reimagination of political boundaries beyond nation states, because nation states are often those which have sort of divided us in divided cultures, divided ecologies. In South Asia, for instance, these nation state boundaries have created conflicts and wars and so on. And so how does one sort of reimagine politics or governance or management or planning in for instance, for a river basin, rather than looking at sort of the current political boundaries that we have? These transformations also have to be accompanied by the democratization of the economy itself, bringing back the economy of caring and sharing, recognizing the invisible role of women or elders, taking back control over processes from capitalists or from the state to the workers themselves, people who are actually putting in all the hard work, and completely doing away with stupid notions like GDP, which make no sense whatsoever, and bringing in much more qualitative, sort of mix of qualitative, quantitative indicators, which are really meaningful for people. Even just like, for instance, does everybody have clean water to drink? You know, that doesn't in any way get reflected, even if your GDP is going up at 7% or 10% a year. All of this, and I think this is something that Sara mentioned, would be problematic without also the struggles for local and larger scale social justice. So for instance, localization would also be captured by the right wing and said, okay, localization, we don't want any refugees here. You folks stay out. This area is only for us. Whereas what we're talking about is open localization, where social justice requires that, yes, if there are some people who are needy, if refugees have to come in, they're also welcome, and we will make them part of this kind of system. And finally, of course, recognizing the diversity and the commons of culture and knowledge, the diversity of knowledge systems, and the diversity of cultures. I mean, in India, for instance, there are something like 180 living languages. Ariel tells me that Australian Aboriginal language might be even more than this. And each language hides a library of knowledge. Now, in India, for instance, unfortunately, in schools, we teach only in about 20 mainstream state languages, which means that all this entire diversity of local mother tongues, especially indigenous mother tongues, is being wiped out. So how do we actually sustain that kind of diversity and revive it where it has been lost? Linked to all of this is something, again, my predecessors have spoken about. What we have lost in our modern systems is not just the links with nature, but the sense that we are part of nature. And what modern systems tell us is humans and nature. And it's very hard for us. I always have to remind myself to say humans and the rest of nature. And so how do we actually recreate the right-hand side figure here, which is one where we are part of thousands of species and therefore have to also learn to live in humility with the rest of nature, and not the left-hand one, which is where we're taught that human beings are right at the top of a so-called pyramid. And note here that the man is on top and woman is just behind. Whoever made that figure was being pretty accurate as far as the modern system is concerned. So finally, and I think this is something both Victoria and Sara really emphasized, is ethics. I think in all of this, the most important lesson is not about replicating a successful example and putting it in my place. Replication, I think, is the wrong way to go. It's really about learning the key lessons, the principles, the processes, what went right, what went wrong, and then using those lessons in my own area, in my own ecology, my own economy, my own ideology, my own culture, modifying it with these principles at the core of that kind of an initiative. I don't need to go into all of these. I think these are sort of familiar. They of course work out in different ways in different societies. They won't necessarily look the same, but so much is about, let's say, bullet point 4, which everybody's emphasized, right? Cooperation rather than competition. Looking at the land and nature as the commons, not as privatized. Looking at knowledge as commons, not as privatized. Thinking, doing, acting non-violently rather than violence is not just about physical, it's also about what we think and how we speak, right? So people, you all spoken about interconnectedness, reciprocity, gift, the notion of not just rights, but also responsibilities. And it's really this set of ethics and values, which is so very different from what the dominant system tells us, that we have to be able to focus on. So it's really worldviews that celebrate life. And this is where I come to the end, talking about one notion that's emerged from the Indian experience. So the word Swaraj, just to explain it very quickly, became popular during the independence struggle. It was made popular by Mahatma Gandhi, but it's a very old, very ancient Indian term. And what it means is autonomy, freedom, self-determination, but with responsibility towards the autonomy, self-determination, freedom of others. So the interconnectedness becomes very much part of it. So even as I look inside, I look outside. Even as I change my behavior, I change it in order to make sure that I'm not impacting somebody else negatively. And so, and when I say somebody else, it's not just other human beings, but also other species, so the rest of nature. So it is that sense of, I will assert myself, my community will assert itself, but in doing so, we will also be responsible towards others. And this kind of worldview is spread all over the world, right? From the little I know of Aboriginal Australia, the notion of country, which we've got in this book, many others from across the global south, but also many that are coming from the global north. Degrowth, for instance, from Europe, or ecofeminism, ecosocialism, they all have their own different sort of focus areas and so on. But I think there's some common threads in them, which is really this centrality of ethics and values that we can learn from. And so as we emerge from COVID, what I've been trying to argue is that we need not just a so-called Green New Deal, which has become suddenly very quite a buzzword in the US, Europe, etc., but a sort of a rainbow New Deal, multiple different revolutions along these different lines. And in order to help with this, we've initiated a couple of years back something called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. trying to create a sort of a horizontal, non-hierarchical platform bridge of radical movements in different parts of the world to learn from each other, to jointly vision, to create more collaborations, and to become a more of a critical mass for affecting the changes we need from local to global around the world. So that's the book which Adil and I helped to edit along with 3 other people. I will put in the chat a link. You can all download the book for free. It's right now in English and Spanish. It's also going to be available in Portuguese, Italian, Korean, and a few other languages soon, hopefully. And one on the left is from India, 35 essays of what India could look like in 2100, sort of ideal vision, and then come back down to earth and saying, okay, how do we get there? So it's dreaming along with strategizing by 40 different authors on all kinds of different subjects. With that, thank you again very much. I hope I haven't taken more time than I was supposed to. I tend to do that sometimes. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashish. Really, really fantastic kind of, and really very well connected speakers in so many ways. And I've been kind of reflecting as we talk here about sort of alternative ways of living, and the idea that I've been kind of keeping everyone to an allocated portion of time. This idea that somehow if we manage time appropriately, even that time is important in a discussion like this, that everyone gets a equal and fair share. So I apologize in some ways for saying, you know, here's your 20 minutes, can you stick to that? But, you know, because there's so much more to be said on each topic, and, you know, just acknowledge how the tyranny of the clock in so many ways. So for our 3 speakers, I've noted a couple of questions that sort of have come through the process here. One that came in early was a question about how can non-First Nations people kind of relearn or learn again the kinds of connectedness that we've heard about today, which is kind of mutual, reciprocal, and kind of responsible connectedness. I'm just wondering if any of the speakers would like to talk about that. And I think Victoria came in first with you, so yeah.
That's a very good question. And I think the answer lies in the development of new pedagogy for the Anthropocene. We need to be really equipping our youth to be able to deal with the future in many ways. The first piece of writing I read about the Anthropocene was in about 2010. I just did a web search. Thought this is interesting, an interesting concept. And I came across a paper that was written by a woman from the University of Michigan, a philosopher, and she called it Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene. It's a very important paper still. And she talked about how in the staff room there'd been a discussion, how would you prepare your children for the future? And one man said, I would tell my son to get a gun. One of the things that we can really count on, and what is happening now, I would put to you, and I think Syria is a really good example of this, there's going to be war for war's sake. People are already, you know, more aggressive, they're more extreme, they're angry, they don't know they're angry, they're behaving in ways, and you know, some of that is like a wicked problem because we are really a part of the natural world and we're moved by forces that we don't even comprehend. You know, like when a woman, one of the women who stormed the Capitol here in the States, her friends and family could not believe she did it. 2 years before she was an Obama supporter and a Democrat and lived a kind of ordinary settled life, but something moved her to do this. But what we need to do is really be working hard to bring in ideas about the importance of your relationships with other people, how you manage those, how you minimize conflict, and so on. Huge populations of refugees. I mean, what I'm thinking quite past social justice measures in a way, because we're going to be in such parlous circumstances, and I cannot emphasize this enough. The climate shocks are just one thing. Think of all the extra hurricanes they're getting in this part of the world now. Think about Hurricane Sandy. Think about that like tripling up with climate change. Think about, the whole of Florida being flooded and all of those climate change refugees entering the northern United States. Think about Bangladesh being flooded, and how many, I just looked it up because I was curious. It's something like, is it 220 million? I just get lost with the figures, frankly, but it's millions of people will be moving north. Can you imagine the conflict? I think one basic, really important thing is our youth, our children now need to be learning to use their bodies more. They need to be quick on their feet. They need to be physically strong and capable of, moving over various terrain. And this needs to be happening in succeeding generations. We really don't know when the collapse will come, but there's going to be a collapse, a worldwide collapse of systems that we now count on. And scientists have stopped predicting. I think a lot of you know. Anyway, I won't take up time, but I just wanted to talk about the need for a new urgent pedagogy, being quick on your feet, being able to look at whole situations, how to solve these, being able to work with other people. There will be things like how to get enough clean water. And let alone getting enough food. I'll leave it there.
I would add, I would say, if you're on these lands of so-called Australia, then it's anywhere, but it's about relationship building in struggle and in co-weaving other communities, relationships and economies and polities. And, so if you're sitting in Newcastle, there's where I am, it's got this region has got one of the highest rates of child removal still. And there's struggles about that and about autonomy and sovereignty. Out in Western New South Wales, Aboriginal communities that have kind of been, bureaucrats are dropping in and not providing what the actual Aboriginal leaders and elders are asking to protect their community and keep their community well with COVID, right? And the kinds of resources. And so so it's about looking and opening eyes and then joining in care and solidarity and kinship with these struggles and learning from the incredible amounts of work that's being done and that's being shared in written form, in video form, in toolkit form, and knowing that it's a process of building relationship, of unlearning and of responsibility. So that's what I would drop in there.
Maybe just to add a sentence there, I think, and also to respond to Anouk Pinchetti's question, I think it's not really about all of us, especially those of us who might be living in cities, going back to nomadic hunter-gatherer livelihoods. But it's really, even in cities, if one looks at many parts of the world, the decommoning of spaces, the doing away with car parks and converting them into urban gardens or farming plots, which are collectively managed by the surrounding neighborhood, you actually get a sense of working with the earth. You get a sense of working with other people. You get a sense of moving out of your own private lives into more common spaces. And the transition towns movement, for instance, in Europe and elsewhere, is trying to focus on this. So how does one, I think there's many, many different ways by which one can actually bring this sense of responsibility towards each other and towards the earth, even in the midst of some of the most urbanized spaces on Earth. And then slowly, because of that, you also then start to respect how indigenous peoples and other communities, or you start respecting the farmers who have labored to put the food on your own plate, which in fact most urban children don't even know these days. So I think it's that kind of movement also, and very rightly Victoria said, I mean, that needs to start right at the level of the school itself. As a young child in a city, I need to know where my resources are coming from, where my food is coming from, and how can I become a more responsible person in my own neighborhood. Thanks.
I appreciate that, Era. I think this is the sort of conversation where the response to one question takes us in so many different areas, because there's so many different dimensions. And, you know, we could sort of keep moving and flowing with this in so many different ways, and that would be lovely. I think there's sort of maybe one more question. There's been some other things, sort of like the question of alternative measures, and I think some of that's been answered in the chat, and I think that's really great. And I think others might have other sort of knowledge and experiences. I guess scale. I guess perhaps the question about how do you move from a scale of 60 people sitting in a space like this and talking to each other, to a movement that sort of that reaches a tipping point perhaps, or a critical mass, or that sort of shapes a broader country or community. So any comments there on sort of scale?
That's what I was talking about with my the ending bit about like situating it here in these lands, and the kinds of pedagogical work we need to do in community, in organising. And again, there's lots written about that. I've written about it too with others. There's loads and loads written about these kinds of things, that, and hopefully a lot of it's quite available and not behind bloody privatised doors. We try to make stuff available, and I think we engaging with where the struggles are at in the territories that we're in, and trying to engage with these in ways which don't kind of reproduce harm or come in as kind of like prophets telling people what they should be doing. So, I really go with this idea that we need more curanderas. We need more medicine women and men. We need more popular educators. We need more community organising healers in very broad sense. We need more guardian gardeners, right? We need different kinds of modes of understanding what it is to rebuild and rewild and decolonize community, and create the conditions for us to create survivance and joy, right, and flourishing and this creativity. And so many, for me in my praxis with kin and in relation, there's a real reimagining of all these taken for granted concepts, which are, failing really. The practices of politics, the practices of democracy here, and of state governance and of forms of governance organised in the liberal modern state are harmful and are inherently violent in the experience of the communities that I work with. And so it's reimagining that and learning from those peoples and communities and barefoot philosophers and educators and medicine women who are already doing this, and being very mindful, because there's some discourses in the far right that are playing with terms like autonomy, freedom, and survival. So really, really learning to read the territories of what you're stepping into, because I'm seeing, so a really clear one to identify this is if the idea of survival and autonomy harks back to a nostalgic free Australia, and it disacknowledges, right? It's like, where's that coming from? If it only focuses on the state and doesn't bring in settler coloniality and capitalism, these are key markers, right, for what kind of practice is being developed. So also learning to identify is mega important, and we do that together. And obviously all of us have relations with other people, and we're doing work as much as we can, really, I feel already, and that matters.
Can I say that I agree with a lot of what Sarah says. And Ashok, thank you very much for your very informative presentation. I love the idea of this kind of Swaraj, Ecoswaraj. I think people need to be talking about this. I think it needs to come, the future needs to come into our discussion. And that's, you know, with family and kin and with community. We need to be raising these issues. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but there needs to be a discussion about what might be happening. If there is some sort of emergency, what do we have? What do we keep and what do we throw away? You know, what values are going to be most important? You know, helping our children to build close relationships with each other, but also, you know, informing them in a really sort of positive way. After all, they won't have known anything else. You know, I realise with quite a degree of sadness that a lot of the things that I've known and experienced in my life will not be there for people in the future. The sorts of experiences that I've had. Our children and grandchildren will be people of the future. They'll have a whole different set of references, a whole different set of cultural markers that they've grown up with. And you know, they'll be eating different foods, they'll be speaking in different ways. I just think the conversation's really important to raise, to monitor things. You know, for example, I was asked to give a paper on the Australian wildfires in Helsinki a couple of months ago. And what I notice is people around the world think that the wildfires belong in Australia. When you scratch the surface, there are wildfires all over the world. In fact, the ones we need to be most concerned about perhaps are the ones occurring in Siberia, with the melting of the permafrost to the release of methane gas and the devastation that's occurring there that is also adding to the greenhouse gas effect. More than that, there's wildfires across America, not just in California. And where I live in New York State, because I've got an Australian eye and I've lived in the bush, if they've had 8 years of drought, give them another few years of drought and they're going to be in trouble here. There's a huge amount of forest litter. People don't manage these forests around here. Of course, you know, it's the suburbs of New York City. 8 million people used to go into New York City every day. And they don't now with the COVID thing, but people love to live in nature. So they're all living like people do on the North Shore of Sydney, in amongst all of the trees. This conflagration is a possibility, a definite possibility. I'm not sure I'm going to be making contact because I'm so interested with, you know, what are the people who are managing these lands here in New York thinking about this. And I actually think there's a lot more conversations going on than we're aware of, than hit the media. But locally, people need to be looking at their environment. Where are we living? What's likely to happen here? What can we do about it? And the truth is too that in the future, people are going to be living in cities more than ever. We're already highly urbanized on this planet with gigantic cities. We've got to make them much more amenable places to live. Ashok's idea of urban gardens is wonderful. Rooftop gardens, rooftop beehives. We need to be reintroducing nature into cities in really creative ways, and allowing people to be able to, you know, recreate with nature and to work with nature and to, you know, be a part of it. This is all going to raise consciousness about the importance of preserving the natural world. So this subject is so vast. I don't know where to stop. Somebody should be stopping me. Seriously.
I think you're right about the scale and the vastness, but I also like the recognition that local see what's happening just right in our neighborhood, in our local places is a really great acknowledgement. So if it's okay, I'd like to hand over to Hamed just to sort of close and give a quick promotion of the next seminar, and to say thank you everyone for being here this morning, and thank you again. And I think everyone would like to just share their thanks for our 3 speakers. So thank you. So Hamed, yeah.
Thank you. I don't have much to say except that again, the next session will happen on the 10th of September, 9:30 a.m. Sydney time, and we have Noam Chomsky, Professor Gar Alprovitz, and Associate Professor Ariel Saleh with us. And we would like, as I said before, this project is a kind of a platform, a common platform we're trying to create. And of course, because we don't have enough time to hear from everyone, NENA Research Center or Hub has created a survey, a social survey, and I have shared that link with you. We also would like to hear from you, and that might be a little opportunity that we can hear from you by just answering some of those questions for us. We will really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks again.
Take care.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Sara, thank you, Ashish. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. So,
Hi, Sam.